My name is not important, but my story is. I was born into hunger, into fear, into a home where love was a stranger. My earliest memories are not of toys or laughter, but of an empty stomach and the sound of glass bottles clinking in my father's hands. As a little girl, I would wake up with the sharp ache of hunger twisting inside me. My mother tried her best. She would boil water and sprinkle a little salt in it, handing it to me as though it were soup. I pretended it filled me, but my belly knew the truth. We had nothing. My father always had money for drink, never for food. He returned each night with a staggering body and a foul mouth, shouting curses, his eyes wild and red. He looked at me not as a daughter, but as a burden. Once, when I was 8, I whispered, "Papa, I'm hungry." He glared at me, his face twisting with rage, and shouted, "You think I have money for you? You're nothing but a burden." Then he threw a bottle against the wall, and the glass shattered inches from my feet. From that day on, I never asked him for anything again. My mother worked herself to the bone. She washed clothes for neighbors, swept floors, carried water from far away. Her hands bled in the winter, her back bent from endless labor. Yet even then, she could not fill our stomachs. I remember one week when we ate almost nothing for 3 days. On the 4th, she brought home a stale piece of bread. She broke it in half and pushed one piece toward me. I begged her to eat, but she shook her head and said softly, "I already had something." I knew she hadn't. With tears in my eyes, I ate my half, while she sat with an empty stomach, smiling at me through her pain. At night, the house was not a place of rest but of fear. My father returned drunk, his temper exploding without reason. Sometimes he struck my mother, sometimes he struck me. His words were sharper than his fists: "You'll never be anything. Worthless, just like your mother." Those words dug deep into me, and for a long time I believed them. But somewhere inside, a tiny voice whispered back, "Number. One day you will prove him wrong." One stormy night, he came home furious from a fight at the liquor shop. He kicked the door open and hurled a clay pot across the room. It shattered near me, and my mother pulled me into her arms, shielding me with her own body. That night, as the rain poured through the holes in our roof, I prayed not for food, not for comfort, but for just a few hours of peace. The next morning, I stepped outside into the mud, looked up at the clearing sky, and whispered to myself, "Someday, I will walk away from here. Someday, I will find a sky without storms." But childhood moves slowly, and every day felt like another battle with hunger and despair. Neighbors pitied me. I heard them whisper, "That drunkard's family, poor child, she has no future." Their words burned, but they also lit a fire inside me. I wanted to prove them wrong. I wanted to show the world that even a girl born in misery could rise. For now, though, I was still just a little girl in a house that was falling apart, holding two things inside me: endless pain, and a tiny spark of hope. Hunger became my closest companion. It was always there, morning and night, whispering inside my stomach, reminding me that life had given me nothing. People think hunger is only about food, but it is more than that. Hunger eats away at your dignity, your confidence, even your dreams. There were days when the sun rose and I wished it hadn't. Because daylight meant facing another day of pretending to live while slowly breaking inside. My friends at school carried lunch in small tins. I carried nothing. I would sit alone, watching them eat, my throat tight with shame. Sometimes I pretended I wasn't hungry, but my body betrayed me. The growl of my stomach was louder than my silence. Once, a kind girl offered me a piece of bread. I wanted it so badly my hands trembled, but before I could reach for it, her mother pulled her away, whispering, "Don't share with that drunkard's daughter." The words stung more than the hunger. From then on, I learned not to expect kindness from the world. At home, things were worse. My father's drinking grew heavier. He stumbled in late, shouting at shadows, cursing at the air. My mother and I tiptoed around him, careful not to wake the storm inside him. But storms cannot be avoided forever. Sometimes his rage fell on her, sometimes on me. His hand was heavy, but his words were heavier. "You are nothing. You will always be nothing." There was one winter I will never forget. The nights were bitterly cold, and the wind slipped through the cracks of our broken walls. We had only one thin blanket, and my mother wrapped it around me while she shivered beside me. I begged her to share it, but she smiled and said, "I don't feel the cold." She always lied to protect me. I closed my eyes and wished I could give her warmth, wished I could give her the life she deserved. On another night, the rain poured so hard it flooded our floor. My father came home drunk, angry because the liquor seller had refused him credit. He slammed the door and shouted, blaming us for his misery. He threw a wooden stool across the room, and it broke at my mother's feet. I clung to her, trembling, praying for the shouting to end. When he finally collapsed into sleep, the silence felt heavier than the noise. Despite everything, my mother tried to give me hope. She told me stories at night, stories of strong women who survived, who built better lives. "You are stronger than you think," she whispered to me. But looking at her tired face, at her thin body worn down by sacrifice, I wondered if strength was really enough. The neighbors pitied us, but their pity was sharp like a knife. I heard their whispers, "That poor girl, she has no future. What can become of a child raised in such misery?" Every time I heard those words, I clenched my fists. Deep inside, a fire began to burn. I didn't know how or when, but I promised myself I would rise above it. I would prove them wrong. Still, promises do not fill empty stomachs. There were nights when my hunger was so deep it felt like my bones were hollow. I pressed my hands against my belly and prayed for sleep to come quickly, because dreams were the only place where food existed for me. Even in that darkness, I held on to a tiny spark. I told myself, one day this will change. One day I will leave this life behind. That hope was all I had, but sometimes, a single spark is enough to keep a soul alive. They took me out of school. My father said girls did not need lessons, that books would not fill a belly, and so the small world I knew was closed like a door slammed in my face. I remember standing by the school gate, fingers curled around the iron bar, listening to the chant of children inside and feeling something inside me harden. That day, the sky seemed lower, the road home longer. When I was inside the house again, messages followed me like shadows. Neighbors' eyes avoided mine. Children who once nodded at me now tugged their mother's sleeves and walked the other way. There was a shame whispered in the market, the drunkard's daughter, and I learned what it was to be someone the town pitied and avoided. Pity was worse than hate because pity carried the truth of helplessness. My mother kept working. She started going farther at dawn to wash clothes in other neighborhoods, returning late with chores undone and with her shoes worn through. She did the small trades she could find, sweeping courtyards, washing dishes, carrying water. I tried to help where I could, but I was still a child with a child's hands and a child's smallness. I couldn't lift full buckets or scrub heavy pots. Mostly I learned to be quiet, to stitch torn sleeves without complaint, to keep our little space clean so our pride, what little remained, did not show its cracks. Because I could not go to school, I read everything I could. Scraps of newspapers, the labels on old medicine bottles, letters that had been left in the neighbor's cottage. Words became secret bread to me. I taught myself to hold letters and sound them out in my head. There was joy in that small learning, a private triumph. I would hide a page and read under the dim lamp at night, the letters floating like small islands of hope. Work came early. At 10 I began running errands, fetching water, selling small bundles of firewood, carrying vegetables in a woven basket for a woman who ran a stall. The pay was a few coins and a hard back, but those coins sometimes meant the difference between a dry mouth and warm rice. Sometimes I begged for extra work, even when the job humiliated me. Pride is a thin thing when hunger is thick. There were people who were cruel in ways that left no bruise. A baker once laughed as I stood asking for leftover crusts and said publicly, "Why should we feed the drunkard's child?" I bit my lip until it bled. Later that night, I rubbed the salt into my finger and imagined that tiny pain would teach me to be sharper, to never beg in that open way again. I learned to hide my wounds. When my father lashed out, words first, then hands, I would find a thin scarf to cover the bruise, or I would say I had fallen while carrying water. My mother and I perfected these small lies together. She taught me how to look at neighbors with a steady face, to say I was well even when the bones felt hollow. Those lies were survival. There were brief escapes. Sometimes a friendly woman would let me sweep her small shop and, in return, she would give me a crust of bread and a smile. Those smiles were like sunlight on my skin, brief and warming, then gone. Once, a teacher from the old school, she lived across the road, left a book on a bench. I stole time to read it when the shop was empty. It was a book of simple poems, the words spoke of other places and kinder skies. I pressed the pages to my chest and cried, feeling both stolen shame and secret wealth. As I grew older, other burdens arrived at the door. There was talk at home about marrying me off early. My father's voice, slurred, said it would be better if I belonged to someone else, at least then there would be one less mouth to feed. My mother's hands trembled as she listened. The idea of leaving scared me and whispered relief at the same time. I was terrified by the thought of being given away as if I were a sack of grain, but part of me knew that marriage might be a way out, a chance for another home, another life. That possibility was both dangerous and luminous. I had a few friends, the kind who learn how to lie for you or to murmur encouragement when the world is loud. They were girls from nearby lanes, their parents also carried small burdens. We would trade secrets behind the bakery wall, pressing our foreheads together and promising that one day we would be somewhere else. We made plans that sounded like treasure maps: run to the city, find work, earn enough to lift families. We took those plans like vows. Children make vows like they are iron, but reality bends even iron into shapes we don't expect. There were cruelties that shaped me. A relative once gave me a dress, but then invited other girls to a festival and told me to stay home. When I protested, he laughed and said, "You don't belong at our celebrations." The heat of shame again flooded me. I learned to swallow those slights. I learned to fold them into a private ledger and use them as counting stones for the future. Evenings were often long. My mother would hum old songs as she worked, songs that had once been words of love but now sounded like lullabies for endurance. I remember tracing the lines of her palms and thinking about all the work a hand can hold. She never asked for help, she gave it. And when she laughed, it was a sound so rare that I kept it like a secret jewel. The town had its small events, weddings where bright cloths hung like flags, processions with drums and sugar-sweet pastries that made my mouth water. I would stand at a distance and watch, the smell of fried treats swirling in the air. I used to fantasize that if I touched one of those flags, the wind would carry me away into that color. But the flags never came near. Life's festivals passed like parades for people who had nothing to do with me. I began, secretly, to practice saying my name differently, more firmly, as if it belonged to a person who mattered. After years of being called the drunkard's daughter, I wanted to own a name of my own. In the corner of the night, under a dim lamp, I would whisper the new name until it felt true. It was a small rebellion, but rebellions can be the roots of great uprisings. By the time I reached my early teens, my hands were practiced in work and my head heavy with plans. I had learned how to bargain for vegetables, how to make rice last for 2 days, how to sow a tear so that no one would see it. I had learned to hear the difference between a neighbor's pity and a neighbor's genuine help. Most of all, I had learned to keep my mouth shut and my eyes alert. The world outside our door was small but full of information. I watched how others negotiated life. I learned that some walked with their chins up and others bent their backs and earned crumbs. I decided that if I were to change my life, I would not wait for kindness. I would take what little chances presented themselves, and I would make them count. So I carried on, quiet, steady, observing. I pinned small dreams to the lining of my heart and promised myself that one day, things would be different. That promise became my companion. It was not loud or flashy, but it kept me awake and moving forward, step by slow step. My teenage years were not a season of innocence, they were a season of survival. While other girls braided each other's hair, dreamed of dresses, or spoke about future husbands, I learned to measure rice by grains and to listen for my father's footsteps like a soldier waiting for war. By the time I was 13, hunger no longer made me cry. It had carved itself into me so deeply that it became normal. My stomach's complaints were like the ticking of a clock, always there, never ending, but no longer surprising. What hurt more than the hunger was the weight of shame. Children my age started to notice things: my torn clothes, my bare feet, the way I avoided crowds. Whispered laughter followed me. I could bear being poor, but being ridiculed, that cut deeper. I still clung to reading, snatching words wherever I could. A kind neighbor once let me keep an old calendar. I studied the words on it until I could spell them in my head. Words gave me a strange kind of power. They allowed me to dream of other lives, other places, where fathers came home sober and children were loved. But reality was sharp. My father grew meaner as the years passed. His drinking consumed everything. Nights were filled with his rage, mornings with his silence. My mother grew thinner, her face more lined, her hair touched with gray before her time. She bore it all quietly, but I saw the exhaustion etched into her body. I began to feel anger, not only at him, but at life itself. Why had fate chosen me for this? Around this time, marriage began to enter the conversations around me. Neighbors whispered, relatives hinted. She is growing. Soon she will need a husband. At first, the thought terrified me. Marriage sounded like another prison, another set of chains. But slowly, I began to wonder if it might be a door instead. A door out of hunger, out of violence, out of shame. I remember one evening vividly. My mother and I were mending clothes under the dim light of a lantern. She looked at me quietly for a long time before she spoke. Your life cannot stay like this forever, she said. One day, someone will come who will take you away from here. Someone who will treat you better than your father ever has. You must hold on until then. Her words were not promises, they were hopes. But I clutched them tightly, because hope was the only wealth we had. In those teenage years, I learned to walk with my head slightly bowed, not in defeat, but in patience. I spoke less, observed more. I discovered how to hide my scars, how to cover the bruises, how to smile when people looked, so they would not see the truth. Pretending became another survival skill. Yet, even as I carried all this weight, a tiny flame lived inside me. I wanted more than survival. I wanted dignity. I wanted to feel what it was like to laugh without fear. I wanted to eat without guilt. I wanted to sleep without listening for the sound of a slamming door. I didn't know when it would happen or how, but I told myself every night, this is not the end. My story will change. And slowly, without realizing it, I was walking toward the chapter that would prove those words true. By the time I was 16, I felt like an old woman trapped in a young girl's body. My back ached from carrying buckets, my hands were rough from endless chores, and my heart carried more weight than my shoulders ever could. Childhood had passed me by without leaving even a shadow. It was around this time that talk of marriage grew louder. My father, though drunk most days, realized he could rid himself of the burden I had become. To him, I was not a daughter, just another mouth to feed, another shame to carry. I remember him saying to my mother, his words slurred but sharp, find someone who will take her. I don't care who, just get her out of here. My mother's eyes filled with silent tears, but she said nothing. She had learned that her silence kept the peace longer than her words ever could. At first, I was terrified. Marriage was not something I dreamed about with joy. I thought it would be the same story repeated, a man who would drink, who would shout, who would see me as nothing. The thought of stepping into another prison made me want to run far away. But I had no place to run, no means to survive alone. Then something happened that I had not expected. One evening, my mother came to me after speaking with a distant relative. She sat beside me, her face tired but strangely calm. There is a man, she said quietly. He is not rich, but people say he is kind. He works hard, and he does not drink. He is looking for a wife, and they have asked about you. I stared at her, my heart pounding. Could this be true? Could there really be a man who did not waste his life on bottles, who did not curse or strike? It sounded like a story, too good to believe. For weeks, the thought consumed me. I watched my father, stumbling through the door, reeking of liquor, spitting cruel words. And then I imagined a different life, one where a man came home with bread instead of bottles, where laughter filled the silence instead of shouting. The first time I saw the man who would later become my husband, he was standing in the marketplace, speaking politely to a vendor. His voice was steady, his eyes clear. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that made me look twice. There was no arrogance, no heaviness of drink. Just simplicity. For the first time in my life, I felt something close to hope. The decision was not mine to make. Girls like me had no choice in such matters. But when my mother asked me softly, "Do you want this life?" I could not stop the tears that filled my eyes. I nodded. Not because I was certain of what awaited me, but because anything was better than the storm I had known all my life. The preparations were simple. There was no gold, no fine clothes, no feast. Just a few borrowed items, a plain dress, and my mother's trembling hands as she adjusted my scarf. She looked at me with eyes full of both sorrow and relief. "This is your chance," she whispered. "Do not waste it." On the morning I left my father's house, I felt both fear and freedom. Fear of the unknown, of what lay ahead. Freedom from the place where I had cried myself to sleep too many nights to count. As I stepped outside, carrying nothing but the small bundle my mother had packed, I whispered a silent prayer: "Let this new life be different. Let it be kind." That day marked the end of my childhood and the beginning of something I had never dared to imagine: hope dressed as marriage, a doorway to a life that might finally be worth living. I remember my wedding morning like a glass of water, clear, simple, and somehow sacred. There were no silk banners, no glittering lamps. My mother wrapped a plain sari around me, tying it with hands that trembled from both hunger and hope. A neighbor lent a small dupatta, and someone smoothed my hair awkwardly because my hands shook too much to braid it myself. We had little, but that morning felt like the only thing in the world that mattered. When I walked into my new home, I felt like a bird that had been released from a cramped cage but didn't yet know how to fly. My new house was small, but it did not smell of stale liquor. There was no broken chair, no smashed bottle, no angry shouting. Instead, there was a quiet that felt like a new language, a language I had always wanted to learn. He stood by the doorway when I came in. At first glance, he looked ordinary, a man who'd risen early to work, hands calloused by honest labor, clothes simple and clean. But there was something in his gaze that I had not seen before: steadiness. He greeted me with a quiet nod and a small smile, the kind of smile that didn't need to be loud to be sincere. No show, no spectacle, just a man offering his life, and for reasons I could not yet understand, I felt safe. The first weeks felt like learning to walk in a new landscape. I kept waiting for something to go wrong, for a fist to fly, for the temper that had shaped my life to find me again. But instead there were small gestures that built a slow, steady trust. He would come home with pockets that held a little extra bread sometimes, and he'd divide it without a second thought. He listened when I spoke, as if my words were precious. He never raised his voice at me, not once. When I burned the chapatis because my hands still trembled from old fear, he laughed softly and said, "It's food. It's ours." That line, so ordinary, felt like a blessing. He worked hard. I learned his rhythms, the way he left before dawn, the way his shoulders hunched from carrying firewood and water, the small hum he made when he fixed things. There was no drunken stupor, no wasted wages. Money was scarce, yes, but it was managed with care. And when there wasn't enough, he did not blame me or my mother. He simply tightened our belts and figured out the next step. There were quiet evenings when we would sit under the small eave and count the stars, and in those moments I began to understand another truth: that love need not be loud to be real. It can be patient. It can be steady. It can be built slowly, like the careful stacking of bricks that makes a home. The contrast with my father was a chasm. Where my father had been chaos, my husband was order. Where my father had been spite, he was kindness. Where my father had been a storm, my husband was the wind that rearranged the leaves gently. There were days when I caught myself watching him as he worked, feeling a strange new sensation bloom in my chest, a mix of gratitude, curiosity, and something that looked like tenderness. I found myself wanting to cook a better meal, to press his shirt clean, to make the small house a little brighter. For the first time, my effort felt like it mattered, not just as survival but as contribution. My hands, which had always known only labor, began to shape things that brought quiet joy. Not everything was perfect. Old fears die slowly. Sometimes, the sound of a slamming door in the neighborhood would make my body shrink, and for a moment I would forget where I belonged. Sometimes I jolted awake from dreams where my father's shadow still stalked me. On those mornings, my new life felt fragile. But he would wake too, feel my tremor through the bed, and without asking, reach out his hand. That simple touch anchored me. It said, wordlessly, "You are safe here." We had arguments, small ones about money, about chores, about whether to sell an old blanket to buy medicine. But our arguments ended with plans, not insults. We negotiated like two people building something together. He taught me how to stitch stronger seams, how to mend a bucket so it did not leak, how to save a little coin each week. I learned to trust that we could face hunger together, rather than being its solitary victims. In time, neighbors began to treat me differently. They saw me with him, noticed the way he held the door open for me, the way he covered our modest little roof with care. The pity that once sat heavy on their faces began to soften into respect. People stopped calling me the drunkard's daughter when he was around. They heard his simple greeting and realized that people could change with a single choice, the choice to be gentle, to be responsible. There were tender moments that still feel like treasures when I think of them. Once, during a cold spell, he walked 3 miles to fetch a borrowed blanket for me. He came back with it wrapped around his shoulders, his cheeks raw from the cold, and his smile shy as a schoolchild's. I remember sitting beside him, our hands accidentally touching, and feeling warmth that had nothing to do with blankets. Another day, he surprised me with a small clay pot. "For the curry you make," he said. It was cracked at the rim, imperfect but mended with care. He had bought it cheaply and repaired it with resin, but to me it felt like a promise, that even imperfect things could be made whole with patience. Years passed and our life, while modest, grew steadier. I learned to trust my own hands again, to knead dough without trembling, to sidestep sudden movements without flinching. He encouraged me to help a neighbor with sewing, and slowly I began to earn a small coin for my own. The first time I counted those coins in my palm, I felt like a child who had found treasure. It was not much, but it belonged to me. I no longer waited for scraps, I could make a small portion of our food, contribute to our tiny home. Pride crept back into my chest, little by little. The man I had been given to became the man I chose in my own heart. His kindness was not a miracle that erased my past, but it was a steady light that showed me how to stitch the torn pieces of my life back together. He taught me the language of simple joys, a warm chapati, a shared laugh, a garden sprouting where a seed was planted with hope. Most of all, he taught me to believe in safety. And in that belief, I began to rebuild not just the roof over my head, but the shape of who I was. I was no longer merely survival, I was becoming someone who could hope and plan. I began to dream again, not of fleeing storms, but of planting trees that would one day give shade to children who would not know hunger as I had. If my first life taught me how cruelty can root itself in a home, this second life taught me how gentleness can root just as deeply. It taught me that there are men who do not drink away their days, and there are houses where quiet is not a threat but a comfort. It taught me that a hand offered without force can become the map to a different future. And slowly, day after day, the wounded child inside me began to learn the shape of peace. The years in my husband's home moved differently than the years of my childhood. They were not marked by fear or hunger alone, but by the steady rhythm of work, seasons, and a kind of quiet companionship that I had never known before. Life was still hard, poverty does not vanish with kindness, but the edges of suffering softened when shared with someone who cared. After 2 years of marriage, something stirred in my life that I had never dared to hope for. I became pregnant. At first, fear wrapped itself around me. I thought of my own childhood, the empty plates, the drunken rage, the nights of terror, and I trembled. Could I bring a child into a world that had once been so cruel to me? But when I told my husband, he looked at me with eyes wide and shining. He did not complain about another mouth to feed, did not sigh at the thought of extra work. Instead, he placed his hand gently on mine and said, "This child will never know hunger the way you did. We will give what we can, and it will be enough." Those words became a vow etched into my heart. I carried them through the months of sickness and weakness, through nights when the baby inside me kicked so hard I could not sleep. My body was thin, and many worried I would not have the strength. But I clung to hope like a rope that kept me from falling into despair. When the day came, it was long and painful. I remember gripping the wooden edge of the bed until my nails split, sweat soaking my hair, tears streaming down my face. My husband's voice was there, steady even in my agony. Hold on. Just a little more. And when the cry of a child finally filled the small room, I felt something I had never felt before. Joy so fierce it broke through every scar inside me. It was a girl. Tiny, fragile, her fists clenched as though she was ready to fight the world. I held her against my chest, and my heart, once a dry well, overflowed. For the first time in my life, I understood what love without condition meant. She was not a burden. She was not shame. She was life, new and unbroken. Motherhood changed me in ways I did not expect. The exhaustion was constant, my body ached, my milk was often not enough, and food was still scarce. But when I looked into her dark, curious eyes, every struggle became bearable. I wanted to be for her what I had never had, a shield, a comfort, a mother who would not let the world steal her laughter. My husband worked harder than ever, taking extra shifts, carrying heavier loads. He came home late, shoulders stooped, but his face would brighten at the sight of our daughter. Sometimes he would hold her in his rough hands and whisper promises to her that made me weep silently. You will learn to read. You will not go to bed hungry. You will know a father's love. There were moments when the shadow of my father's voice crept back into my mind. When the baby cried at night, and my exhaustion turned my patience thin, I would hear echoes of his drunken shouting. Fear clawed at me, fear that I might repeat the cycle. But then I would remember my husband's steady kindness, and I would hold my daughter tighter, whispering, I am not him. You are safe. As months turned into years, the child grew, and with her, a new version of me was born. I laughed more. I dreamed more. I dared to imagine a future. Our little home filled with the sound of small footsteps and the music of a child's laughter, the kind of sound that had never lived in my father's house. It was not always easy. Hunger still visited us, knocking on our door when work was scarce. But we faced it together. Sometimes, my husband would give me the last piece of bread, pretending he had already eaten. Sometimes, I would stitch clothes late into the night to earn a few coins, my daughter asleep beside me. These sacrifices did not feel bitter. They felt like bricks, one by one, building the foundation of a life stronger than the one I had known. And so, in the heart of struggle, love began to weave itself into every corner of our existence. It did not erase the pain of my past, but it softened it. It told me that even a girl from a hungry childhood, even the daughter of a drunken father, could grow into a woman who created warmth, safety, and love. I sit here now, an old woman with silver hair and hands marked by time, speaking into this camera as if it were the eyes of the world. My story is not told for pity, it is told because silence keeps wounds hidden, and hidden wounds poison generations. I was a child who knew hunger like a constant shadow, who feared a father's drunken footsteps more than the darkness itself. I was a girl who learned too early that the world could be cruel, that love could be absent, that safety could be a dream out of reach. For years, I believed that was all life had to offer me, pain passed down like an inheritance I never asked for. But life, unpredictable as it is, gave me a different chapter. My husband, simple, hardworking, kind, became the bridge between who I was and who I could become. He did not erase my scars, but he showed me that scars are not the end of the story. He gave me space to breathe, to heal, to hope. He gave me children who filled my empty heart with a love so fierce it remade me. There were still struggles, oh yes. Hunger still knocked. Illness still came. The world did not suddenly become gentle just because I had escaped one cruel home. But the difference was this: I was no longer facing the world alone. I was no longer unseen, unheard, unloved. And in that difference, I found the strength to build a life worth living. I raised my children not in fear, but in hope. I taught them kindness not by words, but by actions. When food was scarce, we shared. When money was little, we laughed anyway. When storms came, we held each other tighter. My children grew with the knowledge that home is not walls or wealth, it is the place where love makes even the smallest meal a feast. Now, as I look back, I do not deny my past. My father's drunken anger shaped me, but it did not define me. Hunger taught me pain, but it also taught me endurance. And marriage, unexpected, humble, and filled with quiet devotion, taught me that life can be rewritten, that cycles can be broken, that even a broken girl can become a whole woman. I want the world to hear this: you are not doomed to repeat the cruelty you were born into. Pain is a teacher, not a destiny. Love is not always loud or grand, it is often steady, patient, and built from small acts that, over time, become a fortress stronger than fear. If you see me now, sitting here with lines etched deep into my skin, know that each wrinkle carries a story. Some of sorrow, some of endurance, and many of redemption. I am not just the daughter of a drunken man. I am not just the child of hunger. I am a woman who built love from nothing, who gave her children what she never had: safety, warmth, and the belief that tomorrow could be brighter than yesterday. So when I say, from a hungry childhood with a drunken father, to a marriage that changed my life forever, understand that it is not just a title. It is my truth. It is proof that even the most broken beginnings can lead to lives worth living, if only one door of kindness opens. And if my story reaches even one heart, one girl sitting in fear, one boy lost in silence, then may it carry this message: your past is not your prison. You can build a new story. You can be the one who changes everything. That is what I learned. That is what I lived. And that is what I leave behind.